everyone. Good morning, everyone, on this frigid Tuesday in Cleveland. My name is Peter Korotansky, and I'm the director of the Center for Civics, Culture, and Society here at CSU, a new academic unit that is dedicated to the study of the ideas, texts, and traditions at the foundation of our American constitutional republic and society. Our first academic course, Civics 111, also known as the American Republic, is being offered this semester. Our event today brings us back to a time that many of us are trying to forget. In 2021 and 2022, the world screeched to a halt, paralyzed by a fear of a strange new illness, inundated with opinions about how to deal with that illness, both as individuals and as a society. That same fear also caused many of us to forget what might be the most cherished principle of our civilization, namely the freedom to advance our ideas, to debate, and to speak without the threat of government censorship and intimidation. On these topics, our speaker today has a very important story to tell, and it gives me great pleasure to introduce him to you. Dr. Aaron Carity is a physician specializing in psychiatry and author of 5 books, including most recently, Making the Cut: How to Heal Modern Medicine. He is a fellow and director of the program in bioethics, technology, and human flourishing at the Ethics and Public Policy Center, and he also serves in consulting and advisory roles at the Brownstone Institute, Zephyr Institute, Paul Ramsey Institute, and the Simone Weil Center for Political Philosophy. Dr. Carity graduated from the University of Notre Dame in philosophy and pre-medical sciences, earned his MD from Georgetown University, and completed residency training in psychiatry at the University of California, Irvine. For many years, he was a professor of psychiatry at UCI School of Medicine and director of the medical ethics program at UCI, University of California, Irvine, where he chaired the ethics committee. He also chaired the ethics committee at the California Department of State Hospitals for several years. He was fired from the University of California after challenging the university's COVID vaccine mandate in federal court. On a final note, Dr. Carity is also a plaintiff in the landmark free speech case Missouri v. Biden, challenging government censorship on social media. For his work on this issue, journalist Matt Taibbi has called him, quote, the most ambitious theorist of the censorship industrial age. On matters of public policy and healthcare, he has addressed the California Medical Association and has testified before the California State Senate Health Committee and the United States Senate. Dr. Carity consulted on COVID-related ethical issues during the pandemic for the University of California Office of the President, the County of Orange Healthcare Agency, and the California Department of Public Health. You may have also noticed that food is being provided for this event. Please feel free to help yourself as you listen to our speaker, and we encourage you to ask questions at the conclusion of his talk. Please join me in welcoming him to Cleveland State University.
Thank you, Peter. Thank you for that kind introduction. Thank you to Peter and Kishore and the Center for the invitation to speak with all of you today. Thank you to all of you who came out on this cold morning to talk about what I believe is a really important issue. The story of my involvement in challenging government censorship and advocating for free speech started in 2022 when I got a call from a man named John Sauer. Some of you may have heard of him. John at the time was the Solicitor General of Missouri, the lead litigator in the Attorney General's office in the state of Missouri. Now he is Solicitor General of the United States. But at the time, and I joke that John is my second brother-in-law once removed. He married my brother's wife's sister, so I'm not exactly sure what that makes us. But I knew John a little bit through the family connections and through some professional connections. And he called to ask me if during COVID I had been censored on social media, and indeed I had. And so I explained a couple of examples of that. As was mentioned in the introduction, I challenged the University of California's vaccine mandate in federal court. And by the way, if you want to go sideways with your employer really quickly, a good way to do that is to sue them in federal court. But even prior to being fired in retaliation for that legal challenge, I did an interview with a woman named Allison Morrow. Allison was a former Emmy Award-winning journalist with CBS who had left mainstream journalism, was working for the state of Washington, and had a little podcast on the side, as many people do today. So I went on her podcast, and I talked about the ethical and legal issues around vaccine mandates. I didn't get into scientific questions about vaccine safety and efficacy. I just stuck with my area of expertise, which was medical ethics. And the video of that interview was taken down from YouTube. Her account was suspended. And then she was informed by her employer, the state of Washington, that if you don't take down that interview with Dr. Cariotti from the other platforms where it's still posted, you're going to lose your job. And to her credit, perhaps, or perhaps she was a little bit reckless, Allison chose not to take down the interview from the other platforms, and she was fired a week or two after I lost my job. So this was a very surreal experience for me, because I was discussing something that I had taught medical students for 15 years in the required ethics course at the University of California, which was the principle of informed consent, that an adult of sound mind has the right, after receiving adequate information on the risks, benefits, and alternatives of a proposed medical intervention, to either accept that medical intervention or to decline it. This is not controversial. This is a principle enshrined in the 20th century in the Nuremberg Code, in the Helsinki Declaration of the World Medical Association, these landmark documents that established principles of medical ethics and scientific research ethics, which I thought were central to everything that I was doing at the university. Suddenly, we're being tossed overboard in the context of the pandemic, and I, for one, didn't understand exactly why that was happening. And when I started talking about that publicly, not only was I censored, and my interlocutor, the interviewer, was censored, but both of us, in short order, also were fired from our jobs. So I explained this to John. And what he told me was interesting, because at the time, I had experienced multiple instances of being censored on YouTube, on, at the time, Twitter, what is now called X. And I thought, well, this is just the platforms advocating their own policies around speech related to COVID. What I didn't realize was the censorship was not coming exclusively from these private platforms. And we can have an interesting discussion about whether companies like YouTube, owned by Google, Facebook, Twitter, and so forth, should or should not be able to censor constitutionally protected speech. But no one should doubt that the federal government cannot engage in that kind of censorship. And what John informed me is, look, we have reason to believe that this censorship is not just coming from these private social media platforms, that it's actually coming from the government, who is pressuring and coercing and threatening these companies to do its bidding. So the state of Missouri, in conjunction with the state of Louisiana, was filing a lawsuit, which became known as Missouri versus Biden, alleging that this was happening. And they were looking for some private plaintiffs to join the case. So I agreed to join the case as a private plaintiff. I had already sued my employer, so I figured, what the heck, let's go ahead and sue the president. There were 17 different federal agencies, including the White House, named as defendants in this lawsuit. And the first thing I want to say about this case, and about the other 4 plaintiffs, Jay Bhattacharya, who is no longer a plaintiff because he's now working for the defendant. Jay is now the head of the National Institute of Health. Martin Koldorf, who is also no longer a plaintiff, he recused himself because he's working for Health and Human Services. A health freedom advocate from Louisiana named Jill Hines, and a journalist named Jim Hoff. And when you look at the five of us, we were a politically diverse group of people. There were liberals who had voted for Biden, there were conservatives who were voted for Trump, and there were independents who didn't like either of those two presidents or presidential candidates. And for us, this was not a partisan issue, even though the case was called Missouri versus Biden. All of us were concerned about government censorship because none of us wanted any president, left, right, or center, to have his hands on these kind of levers of power, trying to control the flow of information online. And so while most of what I'm going to talk about today and the documents that we got on discovery showed censorship happening around 2020 to 2023 when Biden was in power, I also want to emphasize that I remain very concerned about the censorship that has, in many respects it's improved, but in other respects, in other areas, including university life, the current administration has done some things that I think are of concern. So I just want to frame this issue as, from my vantage point, as a constitutional issue, not a liberal versus conservative issue. That regardless of who's in power, I want to defend the First Amendment and the constitutional right to free speech and free expression. So, with that background, what happened with our case? Well, in 2022, the Department of Homeland Security issued a bulletin, got very little media attention. But it was a striking document because it labeled as potential, quote, domestic terrorism threats, people who were spreading what it called disinformation online. Disinformation, misinformation, and a new term called malinformation. So I guess I and my fellow plaintiffs at the time, for challenging the government's preferred pandemic policies, were considered domestic terrorism threats. A word on definitions. Disinformation is information that I put out there on Twitter or Facebook or in an article in the newspaper that is false, but that I believe is true. That's misinformation. Disinformation is information that's false that I know to be false. But one of the issues that the government was running into was that it was wanting to censor information that was true. And so it invented a new euphemistic term that it called malinformation. And by its own definition, included in this document, malinformation was information that was true, but it's not presented with the right context. Or it might lead people to the wrong kinds of behaviors. In other words, true but inconvenient information was also being censored. Things like saying that the COVID shots do not stop infection and transmission of COVID, which is one of the points that I made in my case against the university's vaccine mandate, that by any traditional definition of a vaccine, these products did not meet that criteria because they were not sterilizing. They did not actually stop a person from becoming infected or transmitting the virus to others. So we had gotten to the point where the government believed that it was okay, in the name of fighting a domestic terrorism threat, to censor true information. In the case, we started getting documents on discovery, and we were surprised to learn a couple of things. Number one, when we filed the case, we focused on censorship mostly related to the 2020 election and censorship related to COVID. But what we discovered is once the various federal agencies, including our public health agencies, started realizing that they could get away with pressuring social media companies to do their bidding in this regard, the censorship started expanding to other issues of interest in our political life. So there was censorship related to both domestic and foreign policy, censorship related to abortion, censorship related to monetary policy, censorship related to critics of our foreign policy at the time. The other thing that we learned that sort of surprised us is initially we thought maybe it's going to be difficult to prove that the government was leaning on or pressuring or coercing these private platforms. Perhaps their interests were so aligned that it was going to look very cooperative. The federal government would make a suggestion about censorship, and the platforms would readily go along with it because they endorse it, in which case it may be hard to prove that it was actually the government doing the censorship. But what we found, to our surprise, and which actually supported the allegations that we were making in the case, is that in many instances, the private platforms tried to push back. They tried to resist the government's pressure to censor, unsuccessfully. And the threats and the pressure would then escalate. So we have emails going back and forth, for example, between the White House and Facebook. The White House's Director of Digital Information, a man named Rob Flaherty, was basically telling a senior executive at Facebook, someone very, very high up in my office is really upset with you, and by the way, when you work for the White House, the person on the other end knows who you're talking about when you say that. Someone very high up in my office is really upset with you because you're resisting our suggestions. They were more than suggestions. You're resisting our demands to take down these 12 accounts that we believe are spreading misinformation or disinformation or whatever. And Facebook tried to push back until eventually they were beaten down and they caved in. So I wrote a piece in the Wall Street Journal called The White House COVID Censorship Machine that documents the back and forth that we saw in these communications between the White House and Facebook. Mark Zuckerberg went on Joe Rogan's podcast late last year and basically confirmed everything that we had alleged in our case. He said, yes, the government was pressuring us. Yes, we tried to resist initially, but we ended up caving in. And he actually, to his credit, publicly apologized for doing that and saying that was wrong, we shouldn't have done that. Around the time that our case was filed, also, Elon Musk bought Twitter, which became X, and he opened up some backdoor communication channels, some Slack channels in Twitter to some independent private journalists. Matt Taibbi was mentioned in the introduction, Barry Weiss, Michael Schellenberger, and other journalists were able to go through those communications between Twitter and the federal government and basically show that what we had alleged in the case was true. So we were getting our documents in discovery around the same time that the so-called Twitter files were being published online, which confirmed what we had suspected. Digging into the history of how this government censorship developed was interesting because it started well before 2020. It actually started during the first Trump administration. In 2017, well, in the waning days of the Obama administration in 2016, President Obama set up a new federal agency called CISA, the Cybersecurity Infrastructure Security Agency. Brilliant government acronym. It has the same word in it twice, just in case you're wondering what it is that they do. So CISA was set up allegedly to protect our digital infrastructure from things like cyber attacks. You know, you sort of say, well, that makes sense that we would have a federal agency to try to protect our digital infrastructure. In 2017, the first director of CISA, a woman named Jen Easterly, one of the defendants named in our case, decided that part of protecting our digital infrastructure included protecting our election infrastructure. And so you sort of say, okay, that makes sense. We got these voting machines, we got mail-in ballots. We got to make sure that those things aren't hacked, right, and that they're secure. But then she took it a step further, and Easterly said, as part of protecting our election infrastructure, we need to protect our cognitive infrastructure. So you can say, well, I think I know what our digital infrastructure is. I think I have some sense of what our election infrastructure is. But what is our cognitive infrastructure? Well, in the queen of all Orwellian government euphemisms, our cognitive infrastructure is literally the thoughts inside of your head, which need to be protected from bad ideas, like the ones certain people are spreading online about COVID shots or about election integrity, whatever the issue, whatever the sort of lightning rod issue might be. And so CISA pivoted very quickly to the business of censorship, because the way to protect our cognitive infrastructure, the thoughts inside of your head, is to control the flow of information online. So this little known government agency that our tax dollars are paying for became the central node, the central hub of the censorship enterprise. And the other government agencies involved in censorship, from the CDC to the FBI to the Treasury Department, actually, was also involved in this, would funnel all of their censorship demands through CISA and through CISA to the social media companies. The other thing that happened around that time was that a lot of the day-to-day work of censorship was outsourced by CISA to quasi-private entities. I call them quasi-private entities because they look like nonprofits or NGOs or research institutes at various universities, but they were actually set up at the government's request. They were staffed, in many cases, by former government employees, and they were funded by government grants from places like the National Science Foundation. So the Stanford Internet Observatory was one of these outfits. It has since been shut down in the wake of our case, exposing exactly what it was doing. And the Stanford Internet Observatory was not a group of academics actually doing research on, online misinformation, as they alleged. What they were actually doing was censorship work. They were hiring interns to basically work around the clock to use sophisticated algorithms to scrape social media and see what ideas were taking hold, and ideas that were disfavored were then flagged for takedown. Those requests would then go from Stanford Internet Observatory, the University of Washington had a similar outfit, other NGOs. Those would be funneled through CISA to the social media companies with the heavy stick, the heavy hand of the federal government behind those quote-unquote requests. So the journalist Michael Schellenberger, who studied this extensively, called this whole public-private network the censorship industrial complex. The first thing I want to say in terms of constitutional law about this arrangement is that what these quasi-private entities were doing was still unconstitutional. The Supreme Court has made it clear that the government is not permitted to outsource tasks or things that would be illegal for the government itself to do, right? So if I hire a hitman to kill you, God forbid, that hitman is obviously responsible for murder, but I'm not off the hook simply because I'm not the one who pulled the trigger. It's the same principle at work here. The novelist Walter Kern, who's written a lot on this whole issue of censorship, had the best analogy to describe how the censorship actually worked in this new digital environment. He said, the censorship was happening, and it was like an engineer at a soundboard mixing a record. And again, using sophisticated algorithms to scrape social media and see what ideas were threatening to go viral that may have been disfavored. Also, what ideas were not organically taking hold and expanding that the government may have wanted to promote. And the engineer sitting at the soundboard could, by tweaking the algorithms, artificially boost certain ideas and artificially suppress other ideas. It's like, we got too much snare drum here, so we're just gonna turn the volume down on that. And we gotta have more cowbell over here, so we're gonna turn the volume up on that. In many cases, the federal government was sending spreadsheets with specific accounts that it wanted throttled to the social media companies. But in other cases, the conversation went like this. Here are a dozen accounts that we found yesterday that we think need to be censored. Please check and see if these posts or these accounts are violating your own terms of service, right? So it looked like sort of a soft power maneuver. Facebook would come back and say, well, we checked these and only 2 of these 12 are violating our terms of service. We think the other 10 are okay. The government would then come back and say, well, you may want to strongly consider changing your terms of service so that those 10 are also impermissible. And in some cases, the social media company caved into those requests and actually changed their terms of service, changing their algorithm. And that's how you got tens of thousands of ordinary Americans trying to post on Facebook or Twitter, being censored potentially tens of millions of Times. So the other aspect of this case that I think is interesting is just the vast scope of the censorship that was happening. Because in previous free speech, First Amendment censorship cases, typically the censorship was one article, one book that's being suppressed, one series that a journalist is writing on, and the White House calling up the New York Times and saying, we think you should quash this story, in the interest of national security or whatever, and maybe the newspaper caving in, right? So it was a sort of a one-off event, which was bad enough and still unconstitutional. But what we're seeing here in this new digital environment, in which the tweaking of algorithms can literally impact the flow of information online, was an unprecedented reach of government power into communications of many more people trying to participate in the public square. So, the random guy sitting on his toilet tweeting something out about COVID or about election integrity or something like that, being censored, and in many cases, not even realizing that he's being censored. Because the other way in which this censorship happened was subtle, such that the user who's being censored may not even realize it. I'll explain how this works. So, when I was censored on YouTube, I knew it was happening, right? They took down the video, it was no longer available. They suspended Allison's account, right? So it was obvious that this was being done. But in most cases, the censorship was much more subtle. It had to do with the scope and reach of the output, with so-called shadow banning, which people thought was a conspiracy theory for a long time, until Zuckerberg and Elon Musk said, no, basically this is how the algorithm works, with content that we don't like. So I put something out on Twitter, and I have a large following, and let's say 85% of my followers are able to see my post in their feed, which sounds pretty good. It sounds like significant reach. Until I realized that the 15% that are not allowed to see what I've posted are those who themselves have the largest following, right? And so by just tweaking things in that way, you can prevent a post or an article that I'm sharing or an interview that I'm sharing from going viral. See how that works? Right? You can suppress how far this thing can go. Censorship was happening even on platforms that people consider to be forms of private communication between friends. So Facebook owns WhatsApp, secure end-to-end encrypted text messaging that you use to communicate with your colleagues, your family, or whoever, right? How is censorship happening on WhatsApp if it's encrypted? Well, supposedly Facebook can't see what you actually type in on that app, but they can see the links that you share. So if you shared an article with your family that was disfavored by the government, people were limited in the number of times that could be shared with other people, or the number of people that link could be shared with. It simply would not show up on the receiving end. So that's the degree to which the censorship actually infiltrated forms of communication that we don't even consider to be public, that we consider to be relatively private, which is also novel and rather astonishing, and something that, again, previous First Amendment censorship cases had not dealt with. So what happened in our case? Well, the district court back in 2023, actually on July 4th, 2023, I think the judge deliberately released the decision on that particular federal holiday, which is very unusual. They issued a preliminary injunction against the government, essentially saying, it looks like what plaintiffs allege in this case is true even before the case has gone to trial, just based on initial documents on discovery and initial court filings. And the court is stepping in to tell the government, you have to stop doing this. In that ruling, the federal judge in the case called this the most egregious violation of free speech in United States history. Again, because of the scope and reach of the censorship. That was not me saying that. That was not our lawyers in the case saying that. That was a federal judge saying it. That injunction was upheld by the Fifth Circuit against about 6 of the agencies named in our case, and the government appealed again, and the injunction went to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court unfortunately sort of punted on a technicality, and the technicality was related to standing. I don't want to get too far down into the weeds, but essentially they said, it's clear that the plaintiffs have been censored. It may even be clear that the government was censoring, but we could not draw a direct line between any one instance of our particular censorship and the federal government. I think the threshold that they set for standing on that injunction was unreasonably high. 3 of the Supreme Court justices agreed. So in a dissenting opinion, Gorsuch, Thomas, and Alito essentially said, by ruling in that way, the federal government has provided, the court has provided the federal government with a roadmap for censorship. Because as long as you don't name names, as long as you don't say, you got to take down Dr. Cariotti or Dr. Bhattacharya's account, and you just order the censorship based on content, you have to censor anything related to the Great Barrington Declaration, which 2 of our co-plaintiffs had been drafters of this document criticizing the pandemics, the government's pandemic policies. As long as you censor based on content, you don't name names, no one is going to have standing to seek redress in the courts. And so that was a concerning aspect of the Supreme Court's ruling. The Supreme Court's ruling was not on the case as a whole, it was just on that aspect of the case. The standing requirements for an injunction are higher than the standing requirements for bringing a case as a whole. And so the case was sent back essentially to the district court to move to the trial phase. The government has since agreed to settle the case. The government has since agreed to settle the case.
That's like government censorship.
There we go. And so we're sitting down and negotiating the terms of the settlement. I don't know exactly how it's going to shake out, but we're going to get at least a partial win and some provisions in place from the court to try to prevent the government from pressuring social media companies. And so I'm optimistic, for two reasons. One, I think our case was able to bring this issue to public attention, along with the Twitter files, along with some journalistic work done on digital censorship around the same time. And, whatever the court decides will be a binding precedent in terms of a federal court ruling. I think this issue of censorship is important globally. So we're fighting this battle on the domestic level. I think it's very important to get a win on this issue in the United States, because we've seen instances over the last few years of government-sponsored censorship in other Western nations and supposedly free democracies and republics. So we saw a judge in Brazil essentially shutting down the possibility of using Twitter there at the behest of the president. There was a big fight between Twitter and the Brazilian government over that issue. We've seen measures introduced in Ireland and other Western European countries that would allow for more government censorship. The strongest free speech protections in the world are here in the United States. The First Amendment of the Constitution is very clear that the government shall not, and the language used in the First Amendment is, the government shall not abridge the free expression, or the free speech of citizens. That word abridge is very important. Anything the government does to suppress your ability to say what you want to say is unconstitutional. When I talk about free speech, people often object, well, what about people inducing others to commit criminal activities? What about things like child pornography? There are certain things that it seems like we shouldn't allow online. And the courts have agreed, actually, there are a small number of very narrowly defined things that are not constitutionally protected speech. Child pornography and other forms of obscenity being one of them. Direct inducement to physical violence would be another that's not constitutionally protected speech, right? But aside from those, the courts have been very good and very clear, and Supreme Court decisions protecting even speech that most Americans would consider to be vile or hateful. Why is it important to protect speech that we disagree with? It's easy to protect speech when the person speaking is someone that we like, someone that we agree with. It's much harder to do that when it's the speech of the political opposition. Okay, this is why I said at the beginning, for me this is not a partisan issue. For me this is a constitutional issue. I don't want President Biden, I don't want President Trump, I don't want whoever the next president is to be able to control the flow of information online by wielding the heavy hand and the big stick of the government. The other reason why I think this issue of free speech is so important, and I'll close with this and we can move to Q&A here in a few minutes, is one of my areas of interest is the history of the 20th century, and particularly the rise of totalitarian regimes in the 20th century. And one of the philosophers that I'm keen on, who studied the rise of totalitarian systems in the 20th century, is a man named Eric Voegelin, an Austrian philosopher who said something very interesting. He said, if you look at all the totalitarian regimes, whether they're the left or the right, whether it's Nazism in Germany, Italian fascism, or Soviet communism, the common feature of all these systems is not concentration camps and gulags, barbed wire fences. It's not secret police and mass surveillance, men in jackboots and so forth, as important as all those things are. So the common feature and the starting point of all totalitarian systems is the prohibition of questions. The regime monopolizes what counts as knowledge, what counts as rationality, and what you're allowed to think and what you're allowed to say. And if you raise your hand and ask any inconvenient questions, the Nazi ideologue or the communist ideologue does not sit down with you and debate, right? Well, I'm not sure that the proletarian revolution is going to lead to a society of peace and freedom and solidarity, right? Well, I'm not going to sit down and debate this question with you. I'm just going to dismiss you. You're not allowed to say that in a polite society. You're infected with bourgeois consciousness. You're infected with Jew consciousness if I'm a Nazi or whatever. You're outside the realm of acceptable opinion, and you need to shut up. Now, if you don't shut up by being excluded socially, then we'll use these coercive, heavy-handed mechanisms and machinery. That's where the concentration camps come in. That's where the surveillance comes in. But as Hannah Arendt pointed out, in a perfectly realized totalitarian society, you no longer need those external mechanisms of control. Those are only important initially when you're trying to bring the population online, inline rather. The end goal of these systems is that the population so internalizes the ideology that the dissenting questions no longer occur to people, right? After a while, you need fewer secret police because everyone is informing on everyone else. And everyone then is policing their own thinking and their own speech. And then you have a population where people are imprisoned, but they don't even see the bars. They don't even realize that the dissenting ideas, or the thought, maybe there's another way of doing things, maybe there's another way to live, those things no longer occur to them. So why was free speech so important to me? Because it seems to me that is always the first thing to go when you're dealing with a tyrannical regime. And the other forms of social oppression will follow from that as mechanisms of enforcing the ideology. But the first step is you're not allowed to ask questions. You're not allowed to have dissenting opinions. And I think a free society has to be based on another premise, which is our shared rationality. We should have disagreements with one another. We should have civil debates, like the center is trying to promote. And that is based on the premise that all of us participate in a shared rationality, that we can in common pursue the truth together. It doesn't mean we're going to find it, doesn't mean we're going to agree with one another, but it does mean that we have to respect the fact that other people cannot be coerced to accept the truth, that reasoned persuasion, as cumbersome and frustrating and difficult as that might be, right, when the other person's not falling into line with my way of thinking, that is the only way for us to proceed in a free society. That's why free speech is so important. Not because there's no truth and so who cares what people say, not because, you know, it's all relative and, you know, every opinion is equally valid. No. Free speech is important because that is the best social context in which we try to engage in the rough and tumble business of debate, dialogue, disagreement, in order to try to approximate as best we can the best way to live together in society, the best way to pursue the common good, and so forth. So thank you all for coming out today. Thank you all for listening to my story about this case. I'm happy to take questions. I'm happy to entertain hecklers because I respect your right of free speech, and all of you have been respectfully listening to my turn to speak. So really appreciate your presence here, and if anyone has questions, we can transition to Q&A.
Stand by. The mic.
Dr. Cariani, I was wondering, through your court case, did it ever become clear, like, which specific individuals had put this plan together?
Yeah.
You know, as far as creating this organization that you mentioned, CIS, and, you know, can you tell us anything more about that?
Yeah.
So, yeah, thank you for that question. As far as I can tell, there was not one single mastermind of this plan, but there were some key people involved. Some of them have been named as defendants in our case. People like Easterly at CISA, the head of the Stanford Internet Observatory, whose name is escaping me at the moment. He had previously worked for CISA. I think his name was Stamos. And so there was a cohort of people starting around 2016 who decided that, and of course they don't use the word censorship. They talk about, you know, combating misinformation, because if you come out and say, well, we want to do this through censorship or we want to do this through propaganda, people are not going to get on board with that program. But two things happened in 2016 that convinced, I think, many of our social and cultural elites that we needed to do a better job of controlling the flow of information online. And those two things, of course, number one was the election of Donald Trump, and number two was the Brexit vote in the UK. So the threat of these populist movements convinced many people that, you know, democracy is all fine and well, but we sort of have to protect democracy from the demos, from the people, the riffraff, who are not making good decisions, not making decisions in their best interest. Like, we can have elections so long as people are thinking the right thoughts and therefore voting in the right way. And so I think there was a movement kind of pushing back against free speech starting in 2017, 2018 in the wake of these two events that sort of rocked Western societies. And the sort of university, government, NGO establishment that felt threatened by these developments really focused on online discourse. So you may remember after the 2016 election that Facebook and Mark Zuckerberg got a lot of blowback, right? And were essentially blamed for the election of Donald Trump. Donald Trump, you know, whatever his virtues and vices, figured out how to, you know, use social media and sort of bait people in that context, and was very effective at using this new medium in 2016 And so many people that were upset by that, the outcome of that election, blamed Facebook for allowing Trump to tell so many lies online and say such nonsense, right? And so I think that's one of the things that sort of primed Facebook to be compliant then when the Biden administration was pressuring it, during the pandemic, essentially. And again, I think maybe it's because of who is currently in power. I don't know his motives. I can't read his mind. Zuckerberg seems to have sort of swung back to a more centrist position, I would say, in saying, look, I neither want to be blamed for the outcome of an election, nor do I want to engage in censorship, regardless of my own political views. And so I think the platforms are moving more in a direction of trying to remain neutral and trying to allow constitutionally protected speech. And it's a really interesting debate about whether the platforms themselves should or should not be able to censor apart from any influence by the federal government. My own view is that they should be considered common carriers under the law. But the Communications Act, Section 230 of the Communications Act, kind of allows the platforms to have their cake and eat it too. So the New York Times can decide what they do and don't want to print. They're a publisher, right? And so they're not under any obligation to print a letter that I submit to them. They have total editorial control. You can call that censorship if you want, but it's really editorial control. But they're also responsible for what they publish, right? So if they publish libelous material, they can be sued, right? What Congress did with the Communications Act when it came to digital platforms is say, you are protected from all liability. You can't be sued if, Cariati posts something libelous about someone else, because there's no way for them to police all the content that's posted on their platform. It would just be impossible for them to, verify the truth of everything that every user is saying online. But at the same time, they're also given total editorial control, like the New York Times or the Washington Post. They can decide, we don't like this content, we're going to take it down. My own view on that question, this is a distinct issue from what I'm talking about in this case, because we're talking about private entities now, we're not talking about the federal government. But my own view on whether private platforms should be able to censor is that the platforms need to pick one or the other. Are you a publisher? Okay, in that case, you're liable, and you have to police all the content the way the New York Times does. Or if you don't want to be liable, which, Zuckerberg has said that would be an existential threat to their business model, which is true, then the government should consider you to be what's called a common carrier under law, like a telephone line, right? If I engage in criminal activity or tell lies, on a phone call, AT&T or Verizon is not responsible for that. They're just a conduit of information. And the user is then responsible for what they say or do online. So my view is that Congress needs to fix that ambiguity that's currently in Section 230 of the Communications Act and force the platforms to pick one lane or the other. And if they're a common carrier, they can censor criminal speech, they can censor speech that's not constitutionally protected, but they have to allow other speech. And, my own view is that users should be able to pick their own filters, right? I want the MS Now filter. I want the Fox News filter. I want a filter that I sort of self-curate so that I don't have to listen to ideas that I don't like. I would be all in favor of that sort of mechanism for users to sort of control the information that goes into their feed. But I think the platforms themselves should not be tasked with trying to figure out what's true and false and trying to figure out what should be allowed and not allowed outside of those narrowly defined categories of criminal speech.
That was actually a perfect segue into my question. First of all, thank you for brilliantly communicating the government influence on social media and with your particular example. I want to give you a follow-up on your point that you were just making now in terms of people choosing what they want to listen to. There is some truth to that, but there's a lot more truth that the social media platforms choose,
Yeah.
right? Because they have algorithms to find out what you like, and they keep pushing you in a particular direction, right? So I have my own example of I'm to one side of the middle, and a colleague who's to the other side of the middle. We agree on a lot of things and have a lot of debates. But I get stuff from social media that pushes me more and more in one direction, and then finds out we get something from the other direction. And I really think that's causing the polarization that we're seeing right now. So I guess my question is there a role for government to help that so that doesn't happen, so that there is less of a polarization that's happening as a result of social media?
So I think you very accurately described a serious problem in American discourse and American public life, is that these algorithms operate usually, psychologists who study the social media realm, suggest that it's anger that typically engages people on Twitter, let's say. And so, you put out some rage bait, you put out something that's, partisan, that your camp is going to cheer and the other side is going to hate. And that tends to get the most likes and views, and then the algorithm drives that into more feeds. And it's very easy if you spend a lot of time online to, without realizing it, sort of get sucked into that vortex and begin to think, everyone who thinks like me is amazing, and anyone who doesn't think like me is totally insane. And not only are they wrong, but they're a bad person, right? So my social media following on X blew up during the pandemic, and this whole case and so forth. And so I was engaging with it pretty heavily. I've pulled back from a lot of engagement on social media since then, because I realized sort of what the feed was doing to me. Even though I try to follow people on different sides of debates, nonetheless, even if you try to curate your own content in a way that's balanced, you sort of feel the effects of the algorithm, latching onto the last thing that you did, or the last thing you liked, or the last thing that you shared, and just giving you more and more of that. So your question, does the government have a role in trying to fix that problem? I don't think I have a good answer to that question. I don't know. The Federal Communications, the FCC, has some rulemaking authority for licensing of the major networks that tries to force the networks to have balanced presentations on issues related to American public life. That's obviously not working. The FCC chairman sent a letter to whatever channel host, I think it was Jimmy Kimmel, when there was that whole kerfuffle over Kimmel's show, briefly got canceled under pressure from the FCC, and then he was reinstated, and it was kind of a political flashpoint for a week or two. That was the FCC trying to regulate something over which it had some authority, to try to push it in the direction of being more balanced, and it didn't really work. And I'm not sure the federal government should have that authority. With something like news networks, initially when that was set up, there was a limited amount of space, on people's television, so there was a limited number of channels, a limited number of space. That was a different era in which, the news networks, the government probably had a role in trying to say, you can't be too partisan, you have to try to present two sides of hotly contested issues. We no longer live in that world anymore, right? And the networks are not people's main source of news. 85% of Americans get their news on social media. It doesn't mean, all the information they're getting is what people post on X, but that's where articles are shared. That's what drives people to read something in the New York Times or the Washington Post or Fox News or whatever. So in this new landscape, I think the more the federal government tries to get involved and force the hand of these private companies, probably the more trouble we're going to get into. And my own view is that we should let 1,000 flowers bloom the government should enforce our laws against monopolies. Some of you may remember Parler, this short-lived app that was sort of a conservative competitor to Twitter. So prior to Elon Musk buying Twitter, there was a perception that Twitter was slanted sort of hard left. And so there was this other platform that was developed called Parler, which billed itself as a free speech platform, but as a matter of practice, it's kind of where a bunch of conservatives started going. And so you had this, you had these two platforms that functioned sort of analogously, and one was considered blue and the other was considered more red. Well, three companies simultaneously on the same day basically destroyed Parler. So Amazon Web Services refused to host Parler on its servers. Google refused to have Parler on its App Store, Google Play Store, so you couldn't download it on Android. And Apple refused to have it on the iTunes, or the Apple Store, so you couldn't get it on your iPhone. And Parler disappeared overnight, right? That seemed to me a coordinated effort on the part of these three large companies to destroy a competitor. That seems to me, I mean, I'm not an expert on our laws against monopolies, but that seemed to be a pretty egregious violation of both free speech and sort of a free marketplace where you could have a platform that had a particular political bent. So I think we should enforce our laws against monopolies so that we have a range of, podcasts, platforms, places to go for information. And that's going to be, I acknowledge, it's going to be a very messy information environment. And there's going to be a lot of crazy stuff that's set out there. I mean, that is the cost of free speech, is that you get a lot of bad ideas that are being promulgated. And I think we have to recover some faith in the common sense of most people. And if we establish an environment in which we can have free discourse, if we have more face-to-face events that are not happening online, in which we can have debates and discussions, I think that can promote a civil culture of decency and discourse. I think the university has a major role to play in debate. Debates on hot-button issues in American public life have become rare on university campuses. I'm an advocate of more public debates. I think public debates are a terrific way to sort of bring people together and have a conversation that reaches across these divisions. I think the more people are online, the more we'll get into an echo chamber. I think it's almost inevitable. I'm just, putting on my psychiatrist hat. It's much easier to hate on and, sort of verbally smash someone online than it would be the same person face to face if you're having a public debate or a public argument. So I think people's behavior just changes when they go online because you're sort of protected from the social repercussions of being a jerk, right? And, I don't know how to do that. I don't know how to move people away from their phones and toward face-to-face interactions, but I think anything that we can do, at the university level, in small groups and social institutions to try to push people in that direction, that will have positive benefits on this whole issue of the kind of radical polarization that we're seeing, where people stop using words and start reaching for their guns. That's a very bad sign for society. You go next.
Yeah, maybe I got 3 more here. So.
Well, I'll keep it short. So I want to pull on 3 things that you said. First of all, thank you for being here, and this is absolutely the right format to be having this conversation. I wish it wasn't this coordinated with having large audience. 3 things I want to pull on. One is, the platforms like Twitter, X, and Facebook, they're referred to as the open space, right? Like public square. And then your characterization that people should be able to choose whatever filter they want to use. That's the equivalent where you could say this event right now is a public square, that's the equivalent of somebody walking in here and saying, hey, give me the Renee Resco version of whatever Dr. Kennedy is saying, or give me the Dr. Kennedy version of that, right? So that's the, so that's where the analogy falls in my mind, when you talk about the public square. And then the third thing is, when you talk about the polarization, isn't there today, with what's happening with what's happening in Minneapolis, there are two versions of truth as they see it, right? One of them is being pushed by the government, right? Another one seems to be not. So when you think about the polarization, some people will only get what the White House thinks is the truth, and some people will only get the other version, so to speak, right? So again, I don't think you or I can have a solution to that per se, but it's fine.
Yeah, I just want to make one quick comment on that, because part of the government's defense in our case is plaintiffs are trying to suppress the government's speech, right?
And what I would say in response to that is the government can and should use its own bully pulpit to say what it wants to say, right? No one's stopping President Biden or anyone in these three-letter agencies from calling a press conference and explaining why their preferred policy is the best one for COVID, right? So we were not trying to prevent the government from saying whatever it wanted to say. We were just trying to prevent the government from going through the back door to suppress the speech of others. The government does have arguably the biggest platform and the most reach to promulgate its preferred ideas and its preferred narrative. And I for one, don't want to attempt to suppress that, whether it's Biden or Trump or Obama or Bush or whoever. You got elected by the American people, you're gonna have a bully pulpit, right? You're gonna have a big megaphone. And half the country's not gonna like that for 4 years, right? But what you can't do is get in the way of others speaking. That guy's exercising his free speech rights too. I don't know what he's working up on.
Hello there, how you doing?
Good, thanks for coming.
I just want to say thank you very much for dialogue. It's very important. And I just want to say last week on MSNBC, I did a story on ICE in Minneapolis.
Yeah.
And I took the information from MSNBC. ICE will be portrayed as.
I'm just going to stand by the speaker so I can hear you.
ICE was being portrayed as bounty hunters who were doing the right thing in America. On the other hand, ICE is also being portrayed as we just basically want America back to how America used to be. I'm sitting at home saying, really? And in regards to what you said on the U.S. government, this is what a lot of people know unknowingly, or just push the subject to the side. A lot of these private groups are funding. A lot of these private groups are funding these type of organizations.
Yeah.
You know what I'm saying? And in regards to the media, and I learned this when I was a college student down here at Cleveland State University. The media can make or break it.
Yes.
And if you don't have the ability to think for yourself what's going on here in this country, you have to get drawn in.
Yeah.
So everything that you were saying earlier about the U.S. government, out with that social media, and it's like you're going to get all kind of feedback, and you're going to get unbalanced in conversations. And that's so crazy here in this country that if you take your phone and video the activity, now you label as a criminal.
Yeah.
And you might get some type of negative feedback if you say activity. So I agree with everything that you stated. Thank you.
Yeah, no, thank you for that. I think the media environment today is very interesting. I was having a conversation with my Twitter driver this morning about this, and we got on the topic of podcasts, and I think podcasts are a really interesting feature of the new media environment. Initially, when social media was coming online, the assumption was people have really short attention spans. They have room for one tweet or a 2-minute video. And a few intrepid people on YouTube showed that actually, if you have a really interesting 2.5-hour conversation with someone, many people will listen to it. Many people want that content, which goes beyond what we got on the network news, which was 2 to 3 minute sound bites. Network news had 2 to 3 minute interviews. Radio had maybe 10 or 15 minutes, a little more in depth, but still fairly brief. And podcasts can go on for an hour or two, and they're very popular. And my Twitter driver this morning was sort of lamenting the results of the last election and saying, I think Kamala's mistake was, when Trump agreed to go on these podcasts, Rogan and a few other people, Kamala didn't feel comfortable in that media setting, and she declined, and I think that cost her in the end. So, on the one hand, we're in an environment in which we're still subjected to a lot of sound bites, quick memes, and sort of a narrative framing of a complicated issue like what's going on in Minnesota, and sort of you pick a side right away. But for those who want to go deeper, there's also opportunities to hear someone sit down for an hour and a half and explain their position. And so I think that's a positive development. I have a love-hate relationship with the online media environment, I would say. We live in very interesting times, but for those who want to do a little more work and seek it out, I think it's easier now in some respects to go deeper on issues, even though it's also equally easy to just take a superficial, sort of memified version of public events and allow that to shape your thinking. So I think there's just a lot of responsibility on individual Americans to try to navigate this landscape and figure out how to get credible information.
Given the technical difficulties, I think this might be a good time to bring the Q&A to a close, and Dr. Cariotti could maybe mingle with you if you have any questions after this. You might be able to ask him more informally. So again, please join me in thanking him for a great presentation.